We're in IXL today, excuse me, and we're going to look at Lesson T.2, which is using MLA citations. These are the in-text citations. These will seem familiar to you because we have used a version of these before. But this is going to be the specifics to MLA, and that's the style that we're using for our research. They're going to start with an example here, and we're going to try to figure out what the answer to this example is. The original source down here in gray says when their three brand new global-sized banks collapsed, Iceland's 300,000 citizens found that they bore some kind of responsibility for $100 billion in banking losses, which works out to roughly $330,000 for every Icelandic man, woman, and child. The writer wants to cite that information, and so says the collapse of banks in Iceland led to $100 billion in losses. That's not specifically stated down here. This is what's called a paraphrase. We're going to need to add an MLA citation to the end of that sentence. We want to use the information. We haven't quoted anything, so we're going to identify how we're going to do an MLA citation for this. I'm not going to read through all this for you. You are certainly welcome to do this. But our source here, and we're going to look at 4 different ways to potentially cite something like this. The source is a novel called The Giver by Lois Lowry. If you haven't read it, please do. It's a good book. It's on page 24. And the text says, "Then it was in his hand, and he looked at it carefully, but it was the same apple, unchanged, the same size and shape, a perfect sphere, the same nondescript shade, about the same shade as his own tunic." If we are going to paraphrase, or whether we're going to quote a small portion of this, we're going to need to identify the author and the page number where this comes from. What that does is that sends the reader, whoever's reading our paper, sends them to our bibliography where they can easily find the source that we're using, because our sources should be in alphabetical order in our bibliography. So when I see Lowry, I'm going to automatically go to the L's in my bibliography, and I'll be able to find Lowry, and I'll be able to see what the rest of the information of that text is. So this is like a little shortcut that sends them to our bibliography. So typically, when we use an MLA citation, it will have a set of parentheses at the end, and it will have the author's name and the page number. Now, notice a couple of things here. I'm going to highlight this early. It's not going to come into play until you get to the upper levels, but there is definitely a space before you begin the citation. Then you have the beginning parenthesis, the author's name, a single space, no punctuation, a single space. You have the page number, the closing parenthesis, and immediately have the period. If you put extra spaces or leave out spaces or put in a piece of punctuation that doesn't belong there, it's going to count your answers as incorrect. So you have to be really precise with this one. All right. Now, sometimes the writer will put the author's name in the text. If the author's name is in the text, like in this one, Lowry uses the word nondescript to describe the apple's color. We already have the Lowry. It's in the sentence. So we don't need that. And we can just come over here and put the page number. So in this case, still have the space, the beginning parentheses, now just the page number, the closing parentheses, and the period. Sometimes you may end up with a quotation toward the end or at the end. We've practiced this, so you probably already know how to do this. But when we have a quotation that's going to end our sentence, Jonah sees the apple as a nondescript shade. We have to close those quotation marks here before we do our parentheses. The MLA citation is not a part of the quote, but it is a part of the sentence. So the citation goes before the period, but it comes after or outside the quotation marks. So take a look at that one. You again have the space, then you have the parenthetical citation followed by the period. And finally, you may have parenthetical citations that happen. They're going to happen at the end of whatever information you're using. So if you look at this, Jonah sees the apple as a nondescript shade. That comes from this information. That comes from the original text. The rest of this sentence, though, which hints at the later revelation that the color does not exist in Jonas's community, that is interpretation. That's not something that we took from Lowry. So we're going to put the citation here before the comma and then before the rest of the sentence. So those are the four situations. If we go back to this original sentence, the collapse of banks in Iceland led to $100 billion in losses. We do not have the author mentioned here. So we're going to have to grab the author's last name, Lewis, and the page number 3. We would put that in parentheses. It won't let me type it there, but it would look like this with the quotation, or I'm sorry, the parenthesis, Lewis 3, and then close parentheses, and then the period. Okay, so you're going to go to T2 and you are going to work on these. Now, I will warn you, they get gradually more complicated. In fact, let's go. You know what? I'll do a different video and we'll walk through these.